Hello, Bible readers. 6 posts ago, I talked about this pivotal moment in Scripture when the Israelites saw that Pharaoh had changed his mind and sent his army against them, and Moses calmly says, "Do not be afraid." Why? Because the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. Whom should we fear? What I said in that post was that when I say I fear the Lord, I'm not saying that God scares me. I'm effectively saying I don't fear anything or anyone else. Nothing else is worthy of my fear when I know God is in this arena called life, death, and the rest of creation, because God is God. Nobody else. Nothing else. So do not fear, be not afraid. We hear this echoed throughout the Old Testament, and of course Jesus says it quite a bit too, because nothing in this world created by God is worthy of the fear of the righteous, the ones whom God seeks to be free. So today's pivotal moment in Scripture, Exodus 20, verse 20, includes another example of do not be afraid. This time it's followed up with, "For God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you so that you do not sin." Remember, Exodus can be split into two big narratives. I talked about this in a different post. The first part is about emancipation from all that enslaves, that is, getting them out of Egypt, that we may be free. And the second narrative of Exodus is all about getting free people who've been freed, getting them to follow God, which means to trust and to obey. Fear of Pharaoh, to build on that other post's understanding of this phrase, fear of the Lord, when I fear a fake worldly power, that fear would pull me away from trusting God, from obeying God. If I'm Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, a Lutheran pastor in Hitler's Germany, it's an extreme example, I know, but if I allow myself, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to fear Hitler more than fearing God, well, then that means I'm going to find myself going along with Hitler's evil schemes, right? My fear of him, of Hitler, would translate to a trust in Hitler, that his power is greater than any other. And that would also translate into an obedience, whether willing or unwilling, to his directives. God saying, I want you to fear me, no other. Not so that you're scared of me, but so that that fear translates into trusting me, knowing that I'm a greater power than any other, and so that you obey me and no other. What you fear is what you trust. It's what you obey. So I will put the fear of me on you so that you do not sin. That's what our pivotal verse is about today. This may feel like a pretty imperfect way to get at the concept of trusting and obeying, for God to get at this desire for us to follow him. But remember the context. The covenant that God makes with Israel is offered as an alternative to the obedience demanded by Pharaoh. Right? God's dealing with a mixed multitude who've lived in real fear, like scaredy fear, for lifetimes. So maybe it helps us in the midst of trying to understand why God uses this troubling phrase, fear of the Lord, to remember that God's kind of saying, I know you have feared Pharaoh. Now, take that kind of feeling. Now you're free to fear me. And know that fearing me doesn't lead to looking over your shoulder or unfair brick quotas. Fearing me, trusting and obeying me, leads to life in abundance, bread in the wilderness even, Sabbath rest, neighborliness. But this phrase, fear of the Lord, isn't only a creature of this context, this post-Pharaoh context. It does come up again and again. Maybe because it comes up first here. Maybe it's always calling upon this experience in Exodus. But fear of the Lord does come up again. It's also appropriate as we get to know multiple facets of who God is. This phrase can be helpful because it helps us see God from another angle, you could say. In chapter 19, God shows up on the mountain with as much literary force as the authors of Exodus can muster. There is fire, there is smoke, mountains shake, trumpets blast, there's thunder. God's holiness feels dangerous. This is not only a God of easy assurance who delivers people from slavery, this is also a God far more powerful than the most powerful forces on earth, including any person. This is a God who must be obeyed. And this is another really important thing for us to consider, that God is not only to be known in one way. We'd like to think God can be known or described as simply as possible. Maybe God is just always thought of to be nice, or just always thought of to be scary. If we could peg God into one spot, that would be predictable, and predictable is controllable. We keep wanting control, even over our understanding of who God is and how God works. We keep wanting to be God ourselves, to control the narrative of God, who God is, and how God works. Too often, we don't allow for God to be bigger and broader in divine personality than just one thing. In fact, I'll hear people say, well, that's hypocritical, or that's not consistent. You said God was this back then, and now you're saying God is that, as though any personality, much less God's divine personality, has to be one thing all the time. Again, predictable is controllable. Is it so hard to imagine that God could be like a gracious bread giver in one moment and also a majestic, all-powerful mountain shaker in another moment? Is it inconsistent for God to be more than a one-dimensional caricature of the God we wish God were? What this pivotal moment in the Bible shows us is that for all we've seen God do, for all we've heard God say up to this point, we also find out at Mount Sinai that this God of deliverance, who wants this relationship with us, shall also be feared, which leads to trusting and obeying. Brueggemann writes about a spectrum of emotional possibilities we may feel when we encounter this living God. They range, in his estimation, from terror to awe. He says it's likely we cannot choose any single point on the spectrum simply because we prefer it. Rather, the formidable presence of God in Israel and in the world evokes thick responses in a rich variety. God will be noticed, and not only in one way. Last thing for now about this fear of the Lord is that it describes a status of engagement. It's almost like I've described my wife, Carla, what am I saying? It's almost like I have described my wife, Carla, over the years. We went from telling people, this is my friend, to this is my girlfriend, to this is my fiance, to this is my wife. We are engaged, or we are married. Married infers fidelity, commitment, promises that have been made and are being kept. Married is an ongoing thing between us. Well, from what Brueggemann is trying to get across, he's saying fear of the Lord is used as a status of relationship, kind of like the way we'd say engaged or married. Fear of the Lord describes a status of engagement between a person and the one true God. Because again, when I say I fear the Lord, the inference is I fear no other, which means I trust no other and I obey no other. My obedience is not based on cringing near the Lord, but on a readiness, a willingness, a visceral commitment to devote my heart and mind to God. So fear of the Lord is not only used as a way to understand the divine personality. It's not only a way to say, I fear this God and no other. It's also a way to describe our relationship. My relationship with God is a fear of the Lord level relationship. So there's still a lot more to think about with this idea of fearing the Lord, but just remember that it's a kind of fear that sets our hearts toward God who is love. That's the point. The point is not to put us in a scary relationship. It's to set our hearts toward God who is love. It's not meant to lead us to punishment or pain, but through trust and obedience, This fear of the Lord leads us to perfect love, as 1 John chapter 4 would say. My next post is going to take us to Exodus chapter 22, verses 21 to 27, God's preferential option. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.